Everyone thinks they know the world's top travel destinations. But now, travelers are turning away from one of the biggest, the United States. Once the third most visited country in the world, America used to attract millions to its cities, parks, and landmarks. But now visitor numbers are falling fast and billions in tourism revenue have disappeared. So why are people suddenly avoiding the US? And what does this mean for the future of American travel? On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we uncover the real reason why US tourism is collapsing. In December 2024, experts predicted a 9% surge in American tourism. But just a few months later, those forecasts flipped. Now the US faces an 8% plunge. The shockwaves are being felt across the entire industry. In 2024, things looked great. Over 72 million international visitors packed into New York City, Miami, Los Angeles, and Disney World, before escaping to Las Vegas so the adults could drink the Magic Kingdom away. Now, the US stands alone as the only major country expected to see a decline in tourism revenue. That projected 9% increase would have added $16.3 billion to the economy. Instead, the country is looking at a loss of around $12.5 billion, a total hit of roughly $28.5 billion in lost revenue. And that's only if things don't get worse. The biggest declines are coming from Canada, Western Europe, and Asia. Canadians, in particular, seem to have lost interest. Inbound visits are down 25%. Considering Canada is right next door, that's not good news. In 2024, Canadian tourists made up 25% of all foreign arrivals to the US. Visits from Western Europe are also down nearly 5%. And financially, this drop doesn't even make sense. The US dollar is weak. Anyone arriving with euros should be able to spend more. At the end of December 2024, €1 got you about $1.04. By August 2025, that jumped to $1.17, a 12.5% increase. In theory, tourism to the US should be booming, but it's not. So let's start with the biggest piece of the puzzle. Why Canadian tourism is falling. Canadians make up the largest group of foreign visitors to the US, and their decline has been steep. If you followed the news, you might have noticed that Canadians aren't exactly happy with the US lately. Experts call it sentiment headwinds. We'll just call it Canada's mad. They're still traveling, just not to America. According to Hyatt CEO Mark Hoplamazian, Canadians are skipping the US altogether and heading straight to Mexico and the Caribbean instead. The entire United States has literally become a flyover destination for Canada. Between January and June 2025, Mexico welcomed 1.68 million Canadian visitors, up nearly 12% from last year. Meanwhile, US air arrivals from Canada dropped 22%, and car arrivals fell 33%. An escalating tariff war between the two countries earlier in 2025, plus a controversial 51st state comment that didn't sit well, has Canadians fuming. And that's not a group you want angry, considering they grew up playing hockey in weather cold enough to stop your heart. So just how mad are Canadians? According to a July 2025 Pew Research Center poll, 64% of Canadians held an unfavorable view of the US, with nearly 40% saying very unfavorable. That's a 20% drop from the previous year, the lowest rating since Pew began tracking in 2002. Even more alarming, 59% of Canadians named the US as the top threat to their country. It's not just economic, though 77% see America as an economic threat. Over half, 53%, view the US as a national security threat. That means Canadians are more worried about the US than China. What does this mean for tourism? When the country that makes up a quarter of your international tourism market dislikes you, that's bad for business. And things don't seem to be improving anytime soon. You know what else isn't helping? The US government itself. In July 2025, a new budget reconciliation bill slashed federal funding for Brand USA, the country's national destination marketing organization, by 80%. Since then, the agency has laid off 15% of its staff. According to Peter Ricci, director of Florida Atlantic University's Hospitality and Tourism Program, we're cutting funding at a time when we desperately need more visitors. Brand USA has been a massive success since its creation in 2010 under the Travel Promotion Act, with a $184 million budget in 2023. It generated around $5.9 billion in visitor spending, an incredible $23 return for every $1 invested. Since 2012, it has helped attract over 10 million extra visitors and brought in $35 billion for the US economy, mostly benefiting small businesses, boutique hotels, and local restaurants. But with funding gutted, all of that progress is at risk. Danny Porter, an executive at Brand USA's creative agency Spark, says rival destinations in Europe and Asia are now spending aggressively to attract the very travelers we're ignoring. She compares the funding cuts to unilateral disarmament in the global tourism competition. The consequences could be severe. When Colorado defunded its state tourism budget in 1993, it lost $1.4 billion in just 2 years and saw its share of U.S. tourism drop by 30%. It took years to recover. And while major destinations like New York, Las Vegas, and Disney World can afford their own marketing, smaller towns and national parks can't. Defunding Brand USA effectively silences those places and cuts off the small businesses that depend on travelers to survive. In short, the U.S. tourism collapse isn't just about economics or bad PR. It's a perfect storm of politics, perception, and policy. And unless something changes soon, America's travel industry may face its toughest decade yet. Some experts point to another major factor behind the decline. Visiting the U.S. has simply become too expensive and frustrating for millions of travelers. Recent tourism analytics report revealed that a family of 4 can spend an entire week in Portugal, including flights, meals, and lodging, for less than the cost of a long weekend at Disney World. An analysis of Las Vegas hotels and resorts, America's entertainment capital, found that in 90 popular properties, the average nightly rate, including hidden fees, reached $404. The problem? Most of those fees aren't even disclosed when booking. Tourists only find out when they check out, after losing their wallets to blackjack tables and overpriced cocktails that barely contain alcohol. It's no wonder that cities with the most aggressive resort and service fees are being hit the hardest. Orlando, home to Disney World, has already seen an 8% decline in foreign visitors this year. In Las Vegas, hotel occupancy dropped to just 76% in July 2025, down from nearly 84% the year before. Experts warn that while major tourist hubs will struggle, the hardest hit will be smaller, lesser-known destinations, the ones without billion-dollar advertising budgets to fall back on. But the problem runs deeper than resort fees. Across the entire U.S., visitors are being overwhelmed by new charges, taxes, and visa costs, and patience is running out. As of October 1st, 2025, international tourists are required to pay a new $250 visa integrity fee. Unless you're from an ESTA-approved country, that's before you even step foot on U.S. soil. This new fee mostly affects travelers from the global south, and that's on top of the existing $185 visa application fee, bringing the total to $435 per person just to enter the country. Technically, the new fee is refundable, but as of late August 2025, the government still hadn't explained how or when refunds would actually work. Even the start date of the policy kept changing for months, leaving travelers confused and frustrated. In reality, it's not the fee amount that bothers people most. It's the constant uncertainty and last-minute rule changes. Potential visitors are choosing to avoid the headaches altogether and take their vacations elsewhere. The Congressional Budget Office insists the new fee will bring in $2.7 billion annually, based on around 11 million visa applications per year. But critics point out the obvious flaw. If the fee is refundable, how can the government count it as income? No one seems to have an answer. Tourism industry leaders aren't convinced either. Analysts at Tourism Economics estimate that the new visa fees could lead to a further 5.4% drop in international arrivals, roughly 1 million fewer visitors per year. And remember, that's on top of the declines already underway. But high visa costs aren't the only reason travelers are turning away from America. Many American hotels have lowered their rates to stay competitive, but it hasn't worked. Fewer visits combined with lower prices have led to a 12.1% drop in revenue per available room. There are also broader American customs that have long frustrated international visitors and continue to grow more annoying. Tipping culture, for example, is not common in most other countries. Even where it exists, it's nowhere near as extreme as it has become in the United States. Even Americans themselves are getting tired of it. Order a coffee at a counter, take a taxi, or even buy a book, and you'll likely be shown a screen asking for a 20%, 25%, or even 30% tip. The standard tipping expectation has been creeping up for years, to the point where 20% is now considered the minimum by many. According to Toast, a company providing point-of-sale systems for restaurants, the average nationwide tip at full-service restaurants was 19.1% in the first quarter of 2025. A generation ago, 10–15% was considered generous. At this rate, The next generation might be tipping half the price of their own coffee, even when they serve themselves. According to Pew Research, 72% of US adults say more places expect tips today than just 5 years ago. Yet only 1/3 of Americans say it's easy to know when to tip, and just as many find it easy to know how much to tip. Even locals are confused. So imagine how lost foreign visitors must feel. One survey found that half of international visitors worry their server or other customers will judge them if they get the tip wrong. 55% fear their local friends will judge them for tipping too little or too much. This creates unnecessary anxiety and tension around what should be a simple, enjoyable dining experience. And that's before even mentioning all the hidden costs travelers face, like surprise sales taxes added at checkout. Most foreigners aren't used to this, since most OECD countries include taxes in the listed price. In the US, however, sales tax varies from state to state, and sometimes even from city to city, when international travelers find their US trips far more expensive than expected, or hear such stories from others. Their willingness to visit declines, but financial annoyances pale in comparison to the outright fear some international travelers now feel enough to keep them away altogether. The United States has always had the authority to deny entry to travelers. In recent years, Customs and Border Protection (CBP) agents have also gained the right to search travelers' phones. By 2025, these practices intensified. More and more travelers are being detained, questioned, or even jailed, sometimes over minor infractions or simple language misunderstandings. Rather than being deported immediately, some visitors have been held for weeks without access to a lawyer or easy communication with their families. As a result, several countries, including Denmark, Ireland, Germany, and Canada, have updated their travel advisories for the US. These notices now warn that even small mistakes at the border or a poorly worded response to a customs agent could result in detention. One such case involved Lukas Zyloff, a German national engaged to a US citizen. He was visiting his fiancée in Las Vegas on a 90-day tourist visa. During a short road trip to Mexico, a US border agent asked where he was going and where he lived. Lucas, whose first language isn't English, answered Las Vegas, but didn't understand the second question. The agent misinterpreted this as an attempt to stay in the US illegally and immediately detained him. His fiancée tried to accompany him to translate, but was instead told to stay quiet and handcuffed to a bench. According to immigration attorney Benjamin Notorio, this is part of a growing trend. It's maximum enforcement these days, he says. Lawyers increasingly report that border agents refuse to tell detainees how long or why they're being held. Travelers on temporary visas, including tourists, have the fewest privacy rights. That means detentions and interrogations can happen at any time, often for reasons that seem random or inconsistent. While such cases are still rare, many people don't want to risk becoming the next headline, especially as stops and searches have already surged and are expected to rise even further. According to immigration attorney Richard Herman, U.S. Customs and Border Protection searched 47,000 electronic devices in 2024, a tenfold increase compared to 2014. Zara Beylu, executive director of the Council on American Islamic Relations, points out that less than 0.01% of travelers are affected. Yet one of the main goals is to create a climate of fear. However, this tourism freefall could change in the near future. The United States is one of 3 host countries for the 2026 FIFA World Cup. Despite Americans being somewhat lukewarm towards soccer, or football, as the rest of the world calls it, it remains by far the most popular sport globally, boasting 3.5 billion fans, nearly half of the world's population. Every World Cup attracts millions of visitors, and as of January 2025, FIFA expects over 5 million inbound tourists to the US, Canada, and Mexico, with the US hosting 60 out of 80 matches. A massive wave of tourists will inevitably arrive. But the World Cup is only a short-term boost, a 39-day event. And that's only if attendance meets expectations. If global sentiment toward the US continues to decline, those numbers could drop sharply. What happens after the World Cup? None of this even considers one major factor behind the decline of US tourism: domestic travel. The good news is that, according to the US Travel Association, American interest in domestic tourism remains strong. 89% of American travelers have trips planned in the next 6 months, according to a March 2025 Longwood study. Travelers here are defined as people who have taken a trip in the past 3 years and plan to take another within the next 2. However, The organization remains cautious about how long this interest will last, as several signs look troubling. To start, 42% of Americans expect travel to become less affordable next year. Research group GSIQ, Global Sports, Sponsorship and Tourism Intelligence, reports that while Americans are still traveling in 2025, they're doing it differently, and differently doesn't mean good news for the tourism economy. Travelers are opting for shorter stays, budget options, and discount deals, meaning they're spending less money. Experts call this rise in microcations. Travelers simply call it, "we're broke." Consumer confidence is at rock bottom, and still sinking. Only 38% of Americans who don't consider themselves wealthy believe they ever will be, compared to 41% in 2023 and 51% in 2019 for most people. Wealthy doesn't mean owning mansions or luxury cars. It just means living comfortably or being debt-free. According to the University of Michigan, consumer sentiment dropped to 58.2 in August 2025, down from 67.9 in August 2024, which was already low after years of inflation and economic uncertainty. And when people feel insecure about their finances, discretionary spending, like vacations, is the first thing they cut. That's a major problem since domestic travelers made up 90% of all tourism revenue in 2024. In August 2025, searches for single-night stays accounted for 40% of all domestic travel searches, up from 33% in January 2023. Searches for 3 nights or fewer also hit a 3-year high, essentially just weekend getaways. Another key indicator is the booking window, the time between booking and travel. A clear negative trend has emerged. More travelers are booking closer to their trips, both to grab last-minute deals and because they lack confidence in their finances to plan ahead. In early 2023, 46% of bookings were made within 28 days of travel. By August 2025, that number jumped to 57%. To make matters worse, domestic travel is becoming increasingly politicized. Compared to November 2024, the number of travelers avoiding specific cities or states rose from 12% to 20%. Those who said politics don't affect their travel decisions dropped from 60% to 46%, meaning over half of Americans now choose destinations based, at least partly, on politics. Add to that a $50 billion travel trade deficit, meaning more Americans are traveling abroad than foreigners are visiting the US, and it's hard to see US tourism rebounding anytime soon. Tourism in the US may be struggling, but around the world, visitors are still making an impact, sometimes a destructive one. Watch Expensive Things Destroyed by Tourists to see the costly mistakes